afternoon. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Encounter, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Diversity and Dignity. I am Marcia Otto, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator of this event. With me today are our distinguished speakers, Chloé Valdary and Justin Giboney. Chloé Valdary is a writer and entrepreneur. After spending a year as a Bartlett Fellow at the Wall Street Journal, Chloé developed the theory of enchantment, a framework for compassionate anti-racism that combines social-emotional learning, character development, and interpersonal growth as tools for leadership development in the boardroom and beyond. Chloé has trained around the world and lectured at universities across America, including Harvard and Georgetown. Her work has been covered in Psychology Today magazine, and her writings have appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Justin Giboney is an attorney, political strategist, and ordained minister in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, which is a coalition of urban Christians who are determined to address the social-political arena with the compassion and conviction of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He co-authored the book Compassion and Conviction, the AND campaign's guide to faithful civic engagement. He has written op-eds for publications such as Christianity Today and The Hill. Please join me in welcoming our guests today. I'm going to start with a question for both speakers and perhaps to you, Chloé, first. As this year New York Encounter's theme state, the topic of diversity, along with equity and inclusion, has permeated our workplaces, schools, and politics, and is often invoked as a paradigm to address complex social issues. Can you help us understand what diversity is, what is its role in society, and what are the lenses through which diversity is seen in today's world?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So this question of what diversity is a striking one. It might seem very obvious. We might think to ourselves, oh, diversity is simply the capacity to be in relationship with someone who looks different from you, comes from a different background, belongs to a different community. And I think that's true on one level, but I think more profoundly, diversity is the capacity to confront the other, which is nothing more than a reflection of your capacity to confront the other within you. And I think that this is very, very important to distinguish because today, in today's world, the cultural script that we often receive about what diversity means is oftentimes a superficial one. It's oftentimes one where we're encouraged to simply reduce ourselves to stereotypes, reduce ourselves to caricatures, and reduce the other to a caricature. But in fact, if we can begin to notice that our inability to be in relationship with the other is oftentimes a reflection of our inability to be in profound relationship with ourselves, with the full complexity of ourselves, with the insecurities within ourselves, for example. Oftentimes when we are not in right relationship with the complexity of ourselves, including the insecurities that we experience naturally as human beings, what we do is we simply take that insecurity and we then project onto the other as a type of defensive mechanism because we're so afraid of being seen, fully seen. This is a deeply human problem and a deeply human challenge. And so I think that this is the more profound question that we must ask ourselves when we're talking about how do we create an equitable society, a diverse society. We're really talking about how can we get in right relationship with ourselves so that we don't project the things that we dislike about ourselves onto the other. And we do this so easily, so haphazardly, and without thinking, automatically. And so, for example, within the framework that theory of enchantment brings to the question of diversity, we often have people ask themselves the very simple question, which is, who am I? And they will do this exercise for 3 minutes, and they will ask themselves, who am I? And for everything that comes up, they are encouraged to say thank you, including those negative aspects that they may not like about themselves. Say thank you. And the purpose of this is to express gratitude, to get into the habit of expressing gratitude for the full complexity of who you are. Because if you can learn how to do this, and this is something that we must all learn how to do, if you can learn how to do this, then you will be less likely to project those aspects, those qualities of yourself that you don't like onto the other. So I'll give you a very quick example. If I'm asking myself, who am I? Then one question, or one answer rather, that might come up is, I'm a hard worker, but that's only true in some contexts, right? So I might say, I'm a hard worker, thank you. I'll express gratitude for myself. And then I'll ask myself again, who am I? I am also in other contexts lazy, right? And I will also say, thank you. I will also express gratitude for that. And this is really important because my capacity to realize that I am hardworking in some contexts and lazy in other contexts makes it less likely that I will project the stereotype of laziness onto another group of people who may not look like me, who may belong to a different political party, etc. So if I can get into the habit and into the practice of accepting my full complexity with unconditional love, then I can start to practice that and direct that towards the other. But if I have not practiced that with myself, then it will be very much difficult for me to practice that towards the other. So I think that the conversation about diversity needs to be rooted in this basic understanding of the human condition and how can we learn self-love and then use that to direct love to the other.
Thank you. Justin, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. First, let me thank New York Encounter for the invitation. It's an honor to be on stage with Marcia and Chloé. I think it's always important, and I agree with, I think Chloé does an excellent job of explaining this. I think it's always important also to put this into context, to put it into historical context. The case for diversity, its merits, but also its excesses, is a response. It's a response to something. I think we run into trouble when we focus in on the response, but we don't examine the initial cause, okay? And so I would say that the push for diversity is a response to historic indignities. It's a response to injustice. It's a response to inequality. And often when we're talking about diversity, a lot of times we are talking about race, we're talking about racism and the disparities that racism has caused. I think it's very important as we talk about diversity to see it within the context, the historical context in America of it being a response to something. And when we talk about, especially when we talk about it in terms of racism, I think Martin Luther King has a very good definition that I think is helpful within this conversation. He says that racism is the false and tragic notion that one particular race is responsible for all the progress, all the insight, and the flow of history. And if we look at history, if we look at imperialism, if we look at even some of the things that the founder said and some of the things that are still in our history books, you see this false narrative. And what that false narrative does is it diminishes the contributions of others. It diminishes at least the perception of the capability of others. And once we internalize that, we begin to see people much differently. And what we've created here, because of that context in some instances, is an kind of asymmetrical judicial body. In a lot of different areas, we see the need for diversity because of how people were treated in those particular moments. And so we want to prevent that diminishment. One way that we can look at diversity, and there's a number of ways to look at it, is through the idea of representation. Those of us who live in a republic should understand the value of representation, right? And I think, unfortunately, and this isn't the way that it should be, but the way that it seems to be, is that in America, if you were not represented at a certain table, if no one at that table looked like you, then your interest probably wasn't represented. Now, I would hope that we would all want that to be different, but the fact of the matter is, if we look at history honestly, over and over we've seen that happen. So one of the very practical things about diversity is it says, based on this history, if we're going to be honest about it, we understand that certain people need to be at the table in order for everybody's interest to be represented at that table. And so I think representation is a big part of what we want to do here. If we think about the issue that we talked about earlier, we see diversity as a corrective, right? It's healing, it's correcting something that had gone wrong. The other thing that I think can be a good thing, and this may connect with what Chloé was saying, is that we see it as helping us with our blind spots too. If we're honest, every culture has its blind spots. As we add diversity, as we talk to people and accept people with difference and diverse perspectives, we have an opportunity to deal with some of those blind spots and have them speak into those blind spots, to have them provide perspective for us in a way that we might not have otherwise. But I think without that historical context, without understanding that even the excesses, again, of how we look at diversity are a response to something and examining what it's a response to, I don't think we get this right.
Thank you. So, Chloé, in your trainings, in your theory of enchantment, you have identified 2 steps in helping with constructive engagement. Okay. All right. Is it better now? Thank you. So in Chloé's theory of enchantment, she has identified 2 crucial steps to allow us to constructively engage with others, right? And you call it, number 1, learning how to love oneself, which is to recognize one's own value and potential. And number 2, learning how to love the other. Can you explain us a little bit more about these 2 steps and how can they help us engage with other in a more constructive way?
Absolutely. So learning how to love yourself and learning how to love the other. This is the essential piece or training or teaching in the theory of enchantment. And to that end, there are 3 principles that animate that. The first principle is you want to not treat people like political abstractions, right? Treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. This is actually a very difficult thing to do, even though it might sound very simple. Because as I have repeated throughout this morning, the human being is a complex being. You are a complex, sophisticated being. And in order to treat others like human beings, you must learn how to treat yourself as a human being, which is, again, to accept that full complexity that I spoke to earlier. So treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. That's the first principle. Second principle is criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy. Again, this can be a very difficult thing to put into practice because oftentimes when we see people engaging in negative behavior, our impulse, our default impulse, and I include myself in this, right? My default impulse is to simply just go off and attack that person and say, you know, you should, not only should you know better, but to really, like, my ego will get involved and my ego will start to condescend to that person, right? As opposed to saying, I want to give you this corrective or I want to show you how you're doing harm, ultimately not just because of my sake, but because of your sake, because I care for you, because I believe in your full potential, because I want to see you succeed, right? That's a very different orientation to root your criticism of another person in. And then the third principle is root everything you do in love and compassion. And again, very simple yet very difficult to put into practice because we find it very difficult to love ourselves. And let me expound upon this for a second. Within the theory of enchantment framework, we're heavily informed by psychology, by cognitive science, by anthropology, and by what I would call, broadly speaking, many of the world's wisdom traditions, including Christianity. And one of the things that we have concluded when it comes to understanding supremacy is the following. Supremacy is fundamentally a defensive mechanism. What do I mean by this? The person who is content within themselves, The person who is secure within themselves will not feel a need to tear another person down in order to feel good about themselves. This is a very, very important thing that we must understand. The supremacists, deep down, and supremacist ideology, deep down, comes from this, but the supremacist, deep down, is operating out of a profound inferiority complex, for which he must overcompensate by tearing another people down in order to build himself up. Now, this is very important because if we don't understand this, then oftentimes the responses to supremacy that we will come up with will actually inadvertently end up perpetuating supremacist culture. What do I mean by this? If I know deep down, and we've seen this, for example, within white supremacist organizations. We've seen, for example, many of the men that end up joining these organizations. You can look back at some of their early age experiences, and you will find oftentimes they've had these moments where they've considered committing self-harm, right? Where they've considered committing other acts of violence against themselves. No one who feels a sense of self-worth, truly, would ever experience that, right? So what's going on psychologically here? If I understand, or if I don't know that a supremacist is actually overcompensating for a deep lack of self-worth, and I violate the second principle of the theory of enchantment, and I respond to a supremacist by saying, you're worthless, right? You're a monster. You will never be good enough. You will never be beautiful. You are irredeemable, right? If in my action and in my orientation I respond to supremacists in this way, I am actually contributing to the very sense of self that person is acting out of in the first place in order to put me down and in order to put other people down as well. So this is something that we have to understand, and I think we're somewhat getting wrong today in our culture, is that what we do outwardly is a reflection of how we feel about ourselves. If I am tearing you down, if I am sending you these really hate-filled invectives, right? Deep down, I am not secure within myself. And so the question then becomes, how do we learn how to get in right relationship with ourselves so that we don't project, so we don't overcompensate, but that we show up in a place of love for ourselves and for the other. And the last thing I'll say about this is, within the theory of enchantment framework, we specifically will cite different pop culture anchors to help people get present within these practices. So as a quick example, I'm a huge fan of Kendrick Lamar. I don't know if anyone here is also. Thank you. Thank you. So in the song DNA, Kendrick Lamar says, I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA, right? We know this song, right? Yes. And what the poet is doing here is he's sharing with you his awareness of the fullness of his complexity as a human being. He is showing you his capacity to look all of his messiness in the face and carry it and hold it unconditionally. This is something that's very difficult for us to do as human beings. But this is what Kendrick Lamar is showing us he has this ability to do. But just as he has power, poison, pain, and joy inside his DNA, I have power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA, and so do all of you, right? And if we can use that lyric, if we can use that artist's expression as a way to bring ourselves into deeper self-reflection, these are not just sources of entertainment. These are things that are trying to teach us something deep and stirring about what it means to be a human being. So if we can use these pop culture anchors to go deeper into self-reflection, I think we can really make diversity all that it can be today.
Thank you. We'll go back to that question, what does it mean to be a human being, in a minute. But Justin, you have argued and you have responded very strongly to a need that you observed of correction, right? You have responded, and you have argued by political engagement. You have responded in ways that you are going to explain to us, but you have argued that compassion and conviction are essential for engaging with individuals, right, from different backgrounds. Can you tell us a little bit about what do you mean by these values and how does that work? How does compassion and conviction can help us engage in a more constructive way?
Sure. First, I want to say, if you don't know Kendrick Lamar, you should. I'm a co-sign that one right there. The AND campaign, my organization, literally stands for compassion and conviction. We see this as a gospel-centered way to go about engagement. And I first want to start by saying I think one of the problems that we have in our culture, and especially in our politics, it rears its ugly head, is a false dichotomy where we have separated compassion from conviction. We have separated love from truth. Either you're for social justice or you're for moral order. And what the AND campaign is saying is that those things work together, that they're not mutually exclusive, that they're not in conflict, that we need to have compassion and conviction, love and truth, and bring those things together. And the fact of the matter is that the Bible brings those things together at their peak, not as some fluffy compromise, but the complete truth and the complete love coming together in Jesus Christ. And so that's what we're trying to get at. And so I'll break each of these down quickly for you. When we're talking about compassion, we're talking about exactly what Chloé was saying, that nobody is a political abstraction. Nobody is just kind of a caricature that you can do whatever you want with. People are not defined by their worst behavior. They're not even defined by their disagreements with us. We tend to have our soapbox and the issues we really care about, and if somebody disagrees with those issues, that's who they are. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a race issue, whether it's about the sanctity of life, if they disagree on that issue, that defines their full character and everything about them, and I think that's false. I think the compassion also helps us seek to understand and seek to sympathize, even if we don't completely agree. It tells us that everybody has a story, everybody has a testimony, and the dignity part is everybody has worth, whether their behavior hides that from us at the moment or not, that we all have a certain level of worth. And I think the compassion gives us what I would call the moral imagination to see human dignity in the most, I would say, the ugliest manifestations of human brokenness. To say you may be showing me the brokest part of you, but somehow I still see a human being who has worth. And this is what I think, as Black History Month, I'd be remiss not to throw this in there. This is what the civil rights movement does. It says, you beat me, you put dogs on me, I will not hate you. Mm-hmm. And I will see the human brokenness in what you're doing and still treat you better than you treat me without some type of reciprocation. And then you have the conviction side of it, which I think is just as important. The conviction comes from the truth that God has revealed to us. And this absolute truth kind of, it protects us from relativism. Mm. It allows us to set up timeless, unconditional standards for justice. One of the things that I tell a lot of young people who are kind of succumbing to postmodernism is that you can't have justice without absolute truth. You can't hold somebody to a standard that they don't believe in unless there's something that transcends both of you. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the truth in this conversation, I think, is very important. And here's the thing. It's a truth that applies to everybody. So while I may understand somebody based off their identity or their experience, they're not justified by their identity or their experience based if they're doing something that's really involves bad behavior, right? It also, I think what the truth also does, it makes us deal with our own brokenness. Not just the brokenness of others. I think we're all good at doing that and pointing out how others have violated us, right? But our brokenness, not just the brokenness of the people who we think have the most power. And the beauty of this, again, is that you need both the compassion and the conviction to make this work. I would say that if you just have the compassion, then it becomes sentimentality, right? It becomes something where it becomes kind of self-indulgence, where everybody else's job is only to confirm what you are and who you say you are. And I don't think that's how God works. But if you just have the conviction, then at that point, it's harshness. It's hypocrisy. You become dismissive. And so we see in the gospel, we see in Jesus a compassion and a conviction. We see somebody who doesn't coddle. Jesus didn't coddle, but he loved, right? Who spoke the truth in love. And when we engage people in that way, I think we give them a chance to speak to us and also to speak to them in a way that they can understand and relate to.
And yet, some of the most common responses to the problem of diversity and response to inequalities has been the creation of the EI committees, training, right, as a response, which both of you already said that is inadequate. I wanted to hear a little bit more, and perhaps now I'll start with you, Justin. What is it, can you give us, in your experience, engaging with people from different political perspectives, right? What is your experience, in your experience, what is it that really helps or hinders this acceptance of the other? Can you tell us a little bit more in a more concrete way?
Sure. I think one of the things that helps is being able to reckon with the past. So if we can't put this in historical context, then it really makes it difficult to deal with the issues that we're dealing with. So reckoning with the past, also admitting the disparities that face us right now. Without that, it's hard to even see why we would need diversity or to see everything as kind of an overreach. The other thing I would say that we have to have is a level of humility. We tend to walk into very difficult conversations with our ironclad narratives. And we want to walk away with that narrative intact. We want people who disagree with us to agree 100% that our narrative is right. The problem with that is that our narratives aren't partially our fiction. They make us look good, they feel good to us, but they're not really real, and the other person can see that. One of the things that I would say to you about walking into conversations is that how many people walked into a conversation with Jesus with an ironclad narrative and walked away with that narrative intact? Not too many. And so I think we have to be willing to walk into conversations and say, I may have gotten this wrong, or my culture may have gotten this wrong. And I'm willing to admit that to you. And then lastly, I would say, and this is only a few things, it's not exhaustive, I would say intellectual honesty. Along with the narratives that we have, once we find a good cause, what we believe to be a good cause, we think it's okay to overstate our case. I had a conversation with a friend one time, and he said, what's wrong if we know racism is real and how much it's hurting people with overstating it? And I had to think about it for a second. I said, what is wrong with overstating it? I mean, the main thing is that you begin to lie, right? And you actually start to undermine your case because people can see that you're not telling the truth, right? And then from there, you lose credibility. It's hard to argue a case when you don't have the credibility. But then there's a breach of trust. And so many of our problems in the public square is because there's no trust between the two sides, because we're trying to maintain these intellectually dishonest narratives and really convince other people that they're true. And so we have to have that intellectual honesty. I'll just say the reverse of that and kind of pass it off. What makes it hard? What makes it hard is pride. It's us wanting to see ourselves as better than other people. It's us not wanting to admit the history of our country, the history of our culture, things that have gone wrong. Pride kind of prevents us from engaging in that way. And then lastly, I'll just say this. Even when we see people engaging poorly when it comes to diversity or when it comes to issues of race, it's never an excuse for you not to engage. Mm-hmm. Too many times I hear people say, yeah, I would get involved in social justice or diversity, but they do it so wrong, I want to stay away from it. Mm-hmm. That's a cop-out. And Christians should never not do good because other people aren't doing it right. And so I would just end with that. Mm.
Thank you. Chloe.
So, yeah, I'd like to piggy off that and just say I think that it's important that we recognize that the reason why we're really confronting this question of diversity and inclusion at this very hour, I think, is because we as a nation are really trying to grapple with pain. And I think that regardless of if we, do it successfully every single time or do it poorly every single time, the root of this is pain. And we are trying to figure out how we can hold that pain, how we can move through that pain, how we can ultimately heal that pain. And that's going to be a messy process, right? And I think we need to understand that and approach that with grace. And another thing I'll say about this is, in terms of overstating the issue, I think there's something that happens, especially when we're confronting a conversation that is rooted in a historical experience that has been painful. That pain is very salient, and oftentimes when something is salient, one can do something that's known in the scientific world as overfitting to the data. Overfitting to the data is when you are looking at a sample. Let's say, for example, you're looking at a sample size, and in your data, you find something very, very prominent. But what you don't realize is that by hyper-focusing on that sample, you're actually within a very specific frame, and that frame is blinding you to other frames that also exist. So I think a very, perhaps, salient example of this is, for example, looking at disparity. Like, we know that historically speaking, African Americans were not given loans. And so the fact that African Americans were not given loans meant that we were less able to actually accumulate wealth compared to our white brothers and sisters, right? This is a fact that has led to wealth-based disparity within our country. But if you're looking at that fact in a data pool and you're hyper-focusing on that path, you can go from simply stating what I just stated to making the claim that the entire African-American experience can be reduced to, African Americans did not have access to wealth. And what that does is that takes this very important frame and it blows it up such that you then begin to caricature African Americans and you reduce African Americans to this one experience. This is a typical and easy example of overfitting to the data. And so we have to be careful that in our desire to pursue social justice, right, in our desire to make a better world, we do not bind ourselves within a frame that actually fails to see the full experience of the African American community, which, yes, has been deeply, deeply wounded by slavery, by Jim Crow, by all these things, but it's also an incredible history of striving for justice, of overcoming, of resilience, of incredible elegance, right? I mean, I attended Langston Hughes Elementary School in New Orleans, my alma mater, and as a 6-year-old, I had to memorize Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. And let me tell you, this is not a poem of sullenness, and it is not a poem of despair, and it is not a poem of degradation, right? She says, out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a path that's rooted in pain, I rise. And it is African American culture's capacity to play with all that life gives us, including the sorrow and the suffering, and to still find an ability to transcend that through art, through poetry, through music, etc. This, too, is a huge piece of our legacy, and I think something, especially this Black History Month, that should be a part of the educational system within America, right? It is something that we are capable of doing in terms of transcending suffering, but also, in point of fact, every culture is capable of doing. And if we can learn how to transmit that educationally, right, we will really be able to move and advance not only this conversation about diversity and dignity forward, but to achieve Dr. King's ultimate dream, which was the creation of the beloved community. And that is ultimately what we are striving for.
Thank you. So I want to understand a little bit better how, and you began by saying that learning to love yourself, learning your roots, learning your value will allow us all to engage with others in a different way. And then you illustrated it so well now with this poetry, right? It brings me the question as to what is it that we have in common with this other, right? What is it that we can learn from each other? Openness, compassion, respect, all of it, right? Comes through the recognition that we, who we are, have something in the roots that is common with this other. Can you tell me a little bit more about what is it that we all have in common, and if that could be a starting point?
So there's a lesson in the theory of enchantment that we teach called Understanding Yourself, Understanding the Other. And in it, there's actually we link to a ad that Michael Jordan did for Air Jordans, and which is a spectacular ad. And he says in the ad, "It's okay if you're scared. I'm afraid too. I'm scared too. You're afraid of what I will become or could become. I'm afraid of what I won't become." And there's this really beautiful moment in that ad where you realize that he's talking to you, the viewer, and in a way you're talking to him, and you realize that simultaneously you are both deeply vulnerable, deeply mortal human beings. And you're navigating this world and this earth with all of the insecurities that bubble up from having this beautifully finite experience. And oftentimes, even though you realize that you're vulnerable, or he realizes that he's vulnerable, but you're afraid to admit it to each other, right? And so what we do is we put on these armors, we shield ourselves because we don't want ourselves to be fully seen because we're afraid of being fully seen. And I think that in a funny way, if we could realize that that's what's common in our experience, that we're actually experiencing an incredibly serendipitous experience just being alive on Earth. You know, life is so short. Life is so short. And if we could really understand that and honor that, and honor the fact that we are all having these limited but incredible experiences, which includes a wide range of emotions from sadness to fear to joy to love. Like, this incredibly deep and profound human experience is actually what we have in common. And that might sound very simple, but I ultimately think we don't stop enough to really contemplate that and really connect over that. Like, I'm so blessed and privileged to be able to be having this conversation with all of you this morning, you know? It's such a joy. And I think that if we could root ourselves in that, and, you know, I have to do this work. Theory of enchantment was created ultimately to help others, but ultimately to help myself as well, you know, because like every human being, I too have an ego, right? And my ego is constantly being like, no, don't do this. No, don't say that. Don't allow yourself to be seen. No, look down on that person. That person doesn't have the same political views as you. Protect yourself, right? But like, obviously, I'm not the only person who does that. Everyone does that. We all do this. This is a part of the human experience, right? So if we could really learn that and learn to love ourselves within that and learn to see the miracle that we are, that this wild and wondrous life that we possess truly is, I think that could just go so far. And I think that's ultimately what we have in common with each other.
Thank you. So, Justin, Chloé tells us about this experience. Are you afraid? I'm also afraid, right? Life is short and it's finite, but there is also a component of the human experience that she is referring to too, which is infinite. There is something in our common, there is something common among us that points to something that is infinite. I'm afraid of my own limitations and the finality of life and the fact that life is short. And at the same time, I am aware of something more. Can you expand a little bit on these components and in answering that question, what is it that we have in common and that could serve as a starting point for a more equal in response to what has been gone wrong?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question because we're at a moment where it is very hard to find common ground. We don't even feel like we have the same facts, right? So we can watch the same thing and come to two completely different conclusions on what actually we just saw and what actually happened. So it is an important question to ask, well, where can we find, what is this common ground and where can we find it? And I think the biggest thing we can say, and so much could be said about this, but it's the Imago Dei, number one, that we are all made in the image of God and what that means about us. And that's truly where dignity comes from, right? Mm-hmm. The idea of dignity comes from the fact that we're made in the image of God. I also say, though, and I think Chloé, again, does a really good job of talking about this, so much of our common ground comes from just the human condition. And not only the suffering that we all go through, but the hopes that we all have. Even if we don't necessarily have them for each other, we have them for the people that we love and that we're close to, that we want to see their flourishing. And how does you wanting to see the flourishing for the people around you and me wanting to see, how do we connect those and share that with one another? And so I think that suffering and the understanding that we all want to flourish is something that we do share, and it's going to take leaders who are very thoughtful to express how that should bring us together and not pull us apart. Because my flourishing can easily mean that I need to do something to you to flourish, and we know throughout human history that's kind of, in many instances, how we've treated it. The other thing I would suggest to find this common ground is to do the hard work of democracy. I think that let's not lose sight of the brilliance of the ideal of democracy. It's an idea that everyone should have a say, not just the people who have the most money, not just the people who are the strongest, not some some intellectual or elite group, that everybody should have a say about what's going on. And I think our cancel culture, our incivility rob us of what democracy is really supposed to be and what it's really supposed to mean. It really throws me off a little bit when I see people who even come from weaker groups saying we can no longer be civil. And the question that I ask then, I say, well, what is the alternative? Because the alternative to civility really, if you take it to its logical conclusion, is violence. And part of the reason you may be in the position you're in is because you don't have the most strength. So why would we want to lean on that rather than something that gives everybody the opportunity to speak? The beauty of civility is not only that it gives everybody an opportunity to speak, it also gives bad ideas a very public death. And we should want that. I mean, if you think, again, another Black history reference, if you think of Frederick Douglass wasn't saying, hey, let's just cancel all these slaveholders. I don't want them to talk. No, he said, I want you to talk. I want you to come debate me because the merits of the case are on my side. And if the merits of the case are on your side, you should always want someone who's opposing you to have that conversation. And I think we should always be very suspicious of people who are trying to cancel others or not have other views being heard, because in many cases, they can't defend what they're saying. We should always want to have that engagement so that other people are heard, and again, so certain views die a public death. We shouldn't be afraid of that if we really know what we believe. But I think all of this starts in relationship. We have to be able to have conversations with others where we actually know what they're getting at. One of the problems that we have is we'll oppose people who are on the opposite side and not be able to articulate what they see the concern as. can I articulate what you're trying to get at, even if I think your conclusion is wrong? And if I can articulate, if I can understand what you're trying to get at, I may have more sympathy for your position and be willing to have that conversation with you. So that's one way to go into the conversation. The other thing is, when you go into a conversation with somebody, don't automatically try to win the conversation. See what you can affirm in what they're saying. You can diffuse a conversation if the person comes in not thinking that one of us has to go out of this feeling, humiliated. No, I don't want to humiliate you. I want to understand where you're coming from. And a good way to do that is saying, you know what, you guys actually get this right, and we've gotten this wrong. Again, if the merits of the case are on your side, we shouldn't be afraid to have that conversation. And so I think those are some of the things that help us find common ground, hear others out, and get to better solutions.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So we would like to thank our speakers again for this wonderful conversation.